Judith Whitcomb pulled the last empty chair away from the dining table and looked directly at her oldest daughter and said, with the kind of calm that only comes from years of practice, "You can eat in the kitchen, Claire. There just isn't room, 14 people, 13 chairs." And a dinner Claire had spent 8 hours cooking alone, while everyone else laughed in the next room. She stood there holding a dish towel she didn't remember picking face, and understood not for the first time, but for the last, that this was never going to change. What happened next shocked everyone in that room, including Claire. See me. If you have ever been the person your family only remembers when they need something, if you have ever cooked the meal, bought the gifts, shown up early and stayed late, and still somehow ended up without a seat, then this story is going to feel uncomfortably familiar. Stay with me. Because the woman who walked out into that snowstorm on Christmas Eve had no idea that the road in front of her was about to lead somewhere nobody in that family could have imagined. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that kitchen. Back to that missing chair. Back to the moment Claire Whitcomb finally stopped being invisible. The ham had been in since 7 in the morning. Claire knew this because she had set the alarm on her phone, driven 40 minutes through light snow, let herself in through Mallory's side door with the spare key she'd been given 2 years ago and never actually needed before. A sound splitting, and stood in her younger sister's enormous kitchen reading a recipe she had written herself when she was 22 years old. Nobody else was awake yet. That was fine. Claire preferred it that way. She worked better alone, always had, and there was something she actually liked about those early morning hours in a kitchen. The smell of butter warming, the way sugar dissolved into something that had no business being as beautiful as it turned out. Baking had always been the one place in Claire's life where what she put in was exactly what she got back. She brined the ham the night before, drove over at 10 p.m., let herself in quietly, did the whole thing in the dark so she wouldn't wake anyone, and now she was pulling it out, patting it dry, scoring the fat in careful diagonal lines the way her grandmother had shown her before arthritis made cooking impossible. Mallory's kitchen was the size of Claire's entire apartment. She tried not to think about that. By 9, she had the ham in the oven, the potatoes peeled and waiting in cold water, the pie crust chilling, and 24 dinner rolls, shaped and resting under a damp cloth. She made herself a cup of coffee using Mallory's expensive machine that required a tutorial she had found on YouTube at 11 the previous night, and she sat down at the island and looked out the window at the snow coming down over the backyard. It was Christmas Eve. She was 41 years old. She had nowhere else to be. That thought arrived the way it always did, quiet, with no drama attached, and Claire pushed it down to wherever she kept the other thoughts. She refused to examine too closely, and she finished her coffee, and she went back to work. Mallory came downstairs at 10:30, wearing a cashmere robe that probably cost more than Claire's monthly car payment, and walked into the kitchen and looked around at the controlled chaos of a meal being assembled from scratch, and said, "Oh, good, you started." Not thank you. Not you didn't have to do all this. Just, oh good, you started. The ham needs about 3 more hours, Claire said. Rolls will be ready by noon. I'll do the pies after I get the potatoes started. Mom wants the cranberry sauce homemade this year. Claire had already made the cranberry sauce. It was in a container in the refrigerator with a sticky note that said cranberry and the date. She didn't say that. She just said, already done. Mallory opened the refrigerator, moved 3 things looking for the orange juice, and closed it without finding the container or apparently reading any of the labels. Derek's parents are coming at 2, she said. Can you have everything ready by then? I'll have everything ready by 1. Great. Mallory poured herself coffee and drifted back toward the living room where the television was already on. The good plates are in the cabinet over the stove. Try not to use the everyday ones for the table. Claire stood at the counter, the rolling pin in her hand, and stared at the place where her sister had just been standing. Then she went back to the pie crust. By noon, the house was filling up. Her parents arrived at 12:15, her mother carrying a single bottle of wine and a small poinsettia, as though that was her contribution to Christmas. Howard Whitcomb, took off his coat, accepted a glass of wine from Derek, and settled into the large armchair in the living room that apparently belonged to him by tradition. Judith Whitcomb toured the kitchen, lifted lids, smelled things, adjusted the oven temperature by 5 degrees without asking, and told Claire that the rolls looked a little pale. "They're still rising," Claire said. Judith went to find Mallory. Claire turned the oven temperature back to where she had it. Derek's parents came at 1:45, which was earlier than 2, which meant Claire had to accelerate the gravy while simultaneously finishing the mashed potatoes and listening to Derek's mother, a cheerful woman named Patricia, tell her 3 times what a wonderful hostess Mallory was. Claire stirred the gravy and said, and did not throw anything. By 2:30, there were 14 people in the house. Claire had counted without meaning to, the way you count exits in a room. 14 people her parents, Mallory and Derek, Derek's parents, Derek's brother, and his wife and their 2 teenage kids, an aunt named Roberta, who Claire had met exactly once, Mallory's college friend Stephanie, who had apparently nowhere else to spend Christmas, and Claire. She had not yet sat down since arriving. She told herself that was fine. She preferred to be useful. She was good at this, and in some part of herself she had stopped examining years ago. She understood that usefulness was the price of admission in this family. You showed up with something to offer, or you showed up with an apology. The dining room was loud and warm, and smelled like everything she had made since 7 that morning. Claire carried out the ham on the good platter, the one from the cabinet over the stove, carefully and set it on the table, and then stood back and looked at the table, and something she couldn't name moved through her chest like a current. 14 people, 13 chairs. She counted twice. She was not wrong. There were not enough chairs. The table was completely set good dishes, the silver that Mallory had gotten as a wedding gift, cloth napkins folded into something that probably had a name, and there were 13 chairs around it and 14 people in the house. And somehow in the 2.5 hours since she had been standing in this kitchen, nobody had noticed. Or maybe they had. Judith was already seated at the far end of the table next to Howard, and she looked up at Claire and then looked at the table and then back at Claire, and her expression was so practiced that Claire felt it in her back teeth. "Oh, honey," Judith said, "we're short a chair. Why don't you just eat in the kitchen? You'll be more comfortable in there anyway." Less crowded. The table had gone slightly quieter. Not silent, the teenagers were still talking. Patricia was saying something to Derek's brother, but the people nearest to them had heard. And there was that particular hush of people pretending not to have heard while making no effort to stop listening. Mallory was looking at her plate. Derek was looking at Mallory. Howard lifted his wine glass and took a long drink. Claire looked at her mother. She thought about the alarm she had set at 6:30 that morning. She thought about the 40-minute drive through the snow, the side door, the dark kitchen, the brine. She thought about the rolls and the pies and the cranberry sauce with the sticky note. She thought about the oven temperature. "No," she said. Judith blinked. "I'm sorry?" No, Claire's voice was not loud. It was not shaking, it was just there, flat and present and done. "I'm not eating in the kitchen, Claire." Howard said her name the way he always did, like a period at the end of a sentence that had already been written. "This isn't the time. There is never a time." She was still looking at her mother. "That's been the problem for about 30 years. There's never a good time to say anything as long as what I want to say is inconvenient." Judith's expression shifted. Not to hurt, not yet. First, to the particular kind of cold that precedes hurt as a tactical choice. "You're being dramatic. I cooked this entire dinner. I was in this kitchen at 7 this morning. I drove over last night to brine the ham. I made the rolls, the pies, the potatoes, the gravy, the cranberry sauce." She could hear her own heartbeat. She didn't stop. "There are 14 people in this house and 13 chairs at this table. And nobody thought to mention that to me before now. And your solution is that I should go eat in the kitchen by myself on Christmas because there's no room for me at my own sister's table." "It's not your table," Mallory said, very quietly. That landed harder than anything. "No," Claire agreed. "It's not. None of this is mine. It never has been." She looked around the table at her father, not meeting her eyes, at Mallory's tight mouth, at Derek's careful blankness. at 14 people, having a dinner that existed entirely because she had stood in someone else's kitchen for 8 hours and made it happen. And I just want you to know that I know that. I just want you to know that I understand exactly what this is. She set down the oven mitt she was holding. "Merry Christmas," she said. She got her coat. Nobody stopped her. Mallory called her name once from the hallway, in the voice she used when she wanted to appear reasonable, but didn't actually want the conversation. Claire kept walking. Howard started saying something as she reached the front door, and she closed it before she heard what it was. The cold hit her like a wall. She sat in her car for approximately 90 seconds, trying to remember how to breathe. And then she started the engine, because if she sat there much longer, she was going to do something. She couldn't predict cry. Go back inside, both, and she needed to move. She drove. She didn't have a destination. She drove the way people drive when they have nowhere to go and too much feeling to sit still, with the way you drive, when the feeling is too weird, when the feeling is too large for any room you currently have access to. She drove through Briar Glen's decorated downtown, past the church with the nativity scene and the hardware store with the lights in the window and the diner that closed early on holidays. She drove out past the edge of town where the houses got farther apart and the streetlights stopped. And then she was on one of those Connecticut country roads that look picturesque in October and genuinely dangerous in December. And she was crying somewhere around mile marker 6. And she was not driving as carefully as she should have been. And then the car made a sound. She knew that sound. She knew it the way you know a sound you've been dreading. Not with surprise, but with recognition. The specific recognition of the thing you couldn't afford to fix. Finally deciding for you that you were going to deal with it now. She pulled to the side of the road. The engine died. The snow was coming down in the kind of thick, indifferent way that doesn't care what your evening plans were. Claire looked at her dead phone. She had been charging it in the car, but the cable she had grabbed on the way out was the one that only worked at certain angles. And somewhere in the last hour, it had found an angle that didn't work. And she understood that she was sitting on the side of a rural road, in a storm on Christmas Eve, with a dead car and a dead phone and absolutely nowhere to be. For a moment, she almost laughed. It was so complete. It was so perfectly, absurdly complete, as though the universe had decided that if she was going to have the worst Christmas of her adult life, it was going to be thorough about it. She pulled her coat tighter and looked out at the snow and tried to think. She was weighing whether she could walk back toward town. Maybe 2 miles, maybe 3. She had lost track when she saw the lights. Headlights behind her slowing. Her first feeling was relief. Her second was caution. Her third, which arrived at the same time as the second, and competed with it, was the specific fear that women on deserted roads at night have that men who have never been women cannot fully understand. The car stopped behind her. Not a truck. Something expensive, she could tell even through the snow and the dark. Something about the shape of it, the way it sat. Black, she thought, or very dark. The door opened. A man got out. He was tall. That registered first tall and large in the way that reads as physical capability before it reads as anything else. He was wearing a coat that cost more than anything in Claire's closet. He walked toward her car through the snow with the careful, deliberate way of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and not in any particular hurry about it. He knocked on her window. She cracked it 2 inches. He looked at her, really looked. In that way people don't usually look at strangers, and he said, his voice steady and low and carrying a kind of authority that didn't need volume. "Your car dead?" "Yes." "Phone? Also dead." He looked at her for another moment. The snow was coming down between them, and the road behind him was empty in both directions, and it was getting colder, and Claire was doing the calculation every woman does, the speed of fear arithmetic, the threat assessment that runs in the background of every interaction like this. Something in his face stopped the calculation, not because he looked harmless. He absolutely did not look harmless. He looked like a man who had spent his entire life in rooms where something very consequential was about to happen. But there was something else, something she couldn't name. "You're going to freeze out here," he said. "I was aware of that." One corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile. Something more controlled. "There's a house about a mile up. Come with me, and you can use a phone. Get warm. Wait out the storm." "I don't know, Yuri." You don't. A pause. The snow kept falling. My name is Gideon Ashbourne, he said. I live in Briar Glen. I'm not going to hurt you. He said the last part the way someone says, something they are not accustomed to, needing to say not defensively, just factually, with the slight impatience of a man who finds explicit reassurance unnecessary, and is offering it anyway because the situation requires it. But I'm also not going to leave you on the side of this road. She looked at him. He looked at her. It's Christmas Eve, he said. Simply, as though that explained the offer and the insistence and all of it. Claire Whitcomb had spent 41 years making the safe choice. Making the practical choice. Making the choice that would inconvenience nobody and require the least explanation and produce the least conflict. She had chosen careful over alive so many times that careful had started to feel like a personality. She opened the car door. The cold hit her full in the face, and she grabbed her purse and her dead phone, and she stood up in the snow, and Gideon Ashbourne held her elbow as she stepped over the ice, at the road's edge a brief, steady grip that he released the moment she was stable, and he led her to the black sedan and opened the passenger door and waited until she was inside before closing it. The car was warm, genuinely deeply warm, in the way of things that cost real money. She sat in the passenger seat of a car belonging to a stranger on Christmas Eve, and she thought with the strange clarity that comes after the feeling gets too large to feel anymore. I have nowhere else to go. For the first time in 41 years, that thought felt like a beginning instead of an ending. Gideon got into the driver's seat. He didn't make small talk. He put the car in drive and pulled back onto the road, and the wipers moved steadily against the snow, and the heater made a sound like everything was handled. Claire sat with her purse in her lap and looked at the dark road ahead of them and tried to understand what had just happened to her life. She didn't know yet what his name meant in Briar Glen. She didn't know what had happened in that town the last time someone told Gideon Ashbourne no. She didn't know what his men did, or who was afraid of him, or what the weight of his name could move in this town. She just knew the car was warm, and he had stopped. And tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had looked at her on the side of the road and decided she was worth stopping for. That was enough. For now, that was everything. The gate opened before Gideon touched anything. Claire noticed that. A black iron gate, tall and serious, set into a stone wall that disappeared into the tree line on both sides, and it swung open as the sedan approached, as though something ahead of them was already watching. There were no visible cameras, but she understood there were cameras. There was a long driveway, gravel under the snow, lined with bare trees, whose branches held the falling snow in ways that should have looked beautiful, and instead looked like something that kept people out. The house at the end of it was not what she expected. She didn't know what she expected. Something cold, maybe. Something that matched the gate and the wall and the particular way Gideon Ashbourne sat in the driver's seat, controlled, economical, the way of a man who had learned to take up exactly the space he intended and not 1 inch more. She expected something intimidating and correct. Ashbourne Manor was enormous and lit from within. Not blazing, not the way Mallory's house was lit, every surface illuminated in the aggressive cheerfulness of someone performing Christmas for an audience. This was different. Warm light from tall windows, the kind of light that suggested actual fires and actual fireplaces. A house that was warm because someone had made it warm, rather than because a thermostat said so. Gideon parked and got out and came around to her side before she had worked out whether she was supposed to open her own door or wait. She opened it herself. He stepped back without comment. They walked to the front door through the snow. It opened before he reached for the handle. The woman who opened it was somewhere in her late 60s, small and solid, with the kind of face that suggested she had seen everything, sane, and found most of it manageable. She looked at Claire with an expression that moved through assessment and arrived at something like concern in the time it took to breathe. "This is Margaret," Gideon said. "She runs the house." "I run him," Margaret said to Claire, with the flatness of someone stating a simple fact. Then to Gideon, "You're late. Road was bad. Her car break down?" "Yes." Margaret looked at Claire's coat, which was not adequate for the weather she had just been standing in, and said, "Come inside," in the tone of someone who doesn't ask twice. The entrance hall was large and stone-floored, and warmer than anywhere Claire had been in recent memory. There was a Christmas tree, actual, large, decorated with what looked like decades of accumulated ornaments rather than anything coordinated or designed. And somewhere deeper in the house, there was the smell of something cooking. Something slow and savory that meant the kitchen had been going for hours. Claire stood in the entrance hall and tried to understand where she was. "Phone's in the study," Gideon said. "I'll have someone look at your car when the storm breaks." I should call someone," she said it, and then understood that she had no one to call. Her parents were at Mallory's. Her friends, the few she had maintained through the years of being too busy, or too tired, or too quietly ashamed of her apartment and her circumstances to do much socializing, were scattered in other states, or celebrating in ways that didn't involve her. She had a coworker named Paula who might answer, but Paula had 3 grandchildren, and Claire couldn't justify calling her on Christmas Eve to explain that she was standing in a stranger's mansion because her family had run out of chairs. Gideon was watching her work through this. "Or not," he said without judgment. I need a minute. Take it." Margaret reappeared with a blanket that had been warmed somewhere. Claire could feel it, and simply put it around Claire's shoulders without asking, the way competent people do things that need doing. "Sit down before you fall down," she said. "You're white as the snow you just walked through." There was a bench near the door. Claire sat on it. She was not going to cry again. She had already cried in a dead car on a dark road, and that was her quota. She sat on the bench in the entrance hall of a house that belonged to a man she had known for approximately 12 minutes, and she breathed. And Margaret stood near her with the particular patience of someone who has handled worse than this, and Gideon leaned against the wall a few feet away and said nothing, which was the right thing. After a while, Claire said, "I'm sorry," Gideon said. "You apologize a lot for someone who hasn't done anything wrong." She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking somewhere above the door, the way people look when they're saying something they haven't decided to make into a whole conversation. His face in the light of the entrance hall was harder than it had seemed in the car. Older, maybe, or just more itself. "I don't know that yet," she said. "That I haven't done anything wrong. You were on the side of the road alone on Christmas. That was my choice, was it?" She didn't answer that. Margaret eventually moved them both toward the kitchen, which was where it turned out Gideon actually lived in this enormous house, not in the formal rooms that were clearly used for other things. Things Claire didn't ask about, but at the kitchen table, where a meal had been kept warm under foil. Margaret set a plate in front of Claire without asking what she wanted, and set one in front of Gideon with the efficiency of long habit, and poured wine into 2 glasses without asking about that either. Claire ate. She was hungrier than she knew. She had not eaten the Christmas dinner she made. She had not eaten anything since a piece of toast at 6 that morning, standing at her own kitchen counter, already running through the recipe list in her head. The food was simple roasted chicken, vegetables, bread, and it was the best thing she had tasted in longer than she could identify. "Margaret cooked this?" she asked. "I did," Margaret said from the other side of the kitchen where she was doing something. Claire couldn't see. "He doesn't cook." "I can cook," Gideon said. "You can heat things," Margaret said. "It's not the same." Claire watched this exchange. There was something in it, some long-established rhythm, some shorthand built over years that made her chest do something she wasn't ready for. She looked at her plate. The snow kept falling outside the kitchen windows, and the house settled around them with the sounds of old stone and heated rooms. And somewhere a clock ticked, and Claire sat at a kitchen table, in the home of a man she did not know, and felt, for reasons she could not explain and did not try to, something she had not felt in so long she had forgotten it was a feeling. Safe. The word arrived in her chest before her brain could reject it. She did not trust it. She had learned not to trust things that felt safe, because the things that felt safe had a way of becoming the things that cost you the most in the end. But she noted it, the way you note a sound that shouldn't be there, not with alarm, just with attention. She noted it and kept eating. She stayed the night. There was no drama in the decision. The roads were closed. By 11, a coating of ice under the fresh snow that made the country roads genuinely impassable. and Margaret showed her to a guest room on the second floor with a matter-of-factness that suggested this was simply the obvious outcome of the evening. The room had thick curtains and a real quilt and a bathroom with actual hot water pressure, and Claire stood under the shower for 20 minutes, thinking about nothing in particular, and then got into the bed and stared at the ceiling. She had walked out of her sister's house. She was in a stranger's guest room. Her car was on the side of a road somewhere. She fell asleep before she could decide how to feel about any of it. Christmas morning came pale and white through the thick curtains. Claire woke at 6:30 out of habit and lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the silence of a large house, and then got up because she could not stay still. She found the kitchen. And she found it fully stocked, not in the way of someone who cooked, but in the way of someone who had a housekeeper who ensured that the kitchen was always theoretically capable of producing a meal. There were eggs. There was bread. There were things in the refrigerator that suggested Margaret cooked with ambition. Claire stood in the kitchen in the large house on Christmas morning, with the light coming gray and clean through the windows and the snow deep and still outside, and she made breakfast. She didn't think about it. Her hands found the eggs and found the pan and found the rhythm before her brain was fully engaged, because cooking was the thing her body knew how to do when her mind was still catching up. She made eggs and toast, and she found coffee, and figured out the machine different from Mallory's, older but well-maintained. And by the time Margaret appeared at 7:45, there were 2 cups poured and eggs staying warm on a plate. Margaret stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at the plate. She looked at Claire. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Claire said. "I wanted to." Margaret's expression was complex, in ways Claire couldn't fully read. She crossed to the table and sat down and picked up a coffee cup, and she said, "You sleep?" "Yes. Well, yours is a very good mattress." I told him those mattresses. 10 years ago. He listened eventually. She sipped the coffee and nodded, once, which Claire understood was a verdict. "He's up already. Running, probably. He runs in any weather." "Don't ask me to explain it." As though on cue, the side door opened and Gideon came in from the cold, bringing the smell of winter with him. He was breathing harder than he would have wanted to be, and there was snow in his hair, and he looked, just for a second, before he saw them, like a man in his own house, rather than the man he'd been in the car. Then he registered Claire at the table, and something rearranged itself in his face, not unfriendly, just contained. "You're up," he said. "Made eggs," Margaret said, as though this explained everything. "Sit down," he said. He ate what Claire had made with the focused efficiency of a man accustomed to fueling himself, rather than enjoying meals, and then somewhere around the second cup of coffee the efficiency softened, and he ate the last of the toast slowly. And Claire watched him without being obvious about it, and she thought, he's lonely. Not in the obvious way, not in the way that asks for acknowledgement. In the deep, embedded way of someone who has lived alone for long enough that loneliness has become infrastructure, not a feeling that comes and goes, but a condition built into the walls. She recognized it because she had lived in that same kind of house. The road stayed closed through Christmas Day. Gideon's people, and there were people, a small constellation of them, who appeared and disappeared through the course of the day, in ways Claire chose not to question too closely, confirmed that the car couldn't be retrieved until the next morning. Claire did not ask what these people did, or why they moved the way they moved, with that specific that was not military, but adjacent to military. She didn't ask because she had lived 41 years by learning which questions made things worse. She spent Christmas Day in Ashbourne Manor's kitchen, and then in its library, and then in the small sitting room off the library that Gideon apparently used as his actual living room, smaller than any other room in the house, crowded with books and papers, and a lamp with a tilted shade that nobody had fixed, the room of someone who didn't entertain in it, but actually lived in it. He showed her the room without deciding to so. He was looking for something, a book, she thought. She followed him out of the library and into the small room, and he found the book and turned, and she was standing in the doorway of the realest room in his house, and he looked at her standing there and didn't tempt her to leave. She sat down in the chair near the tilted lamp. He sat across from her. They talked. Not about big things, not at first. About the town Briar Glen, which Claire had lived in for most of her life, without ever quite feeling like she belonged to it. About the snow and the kinds of winters they'd each grown up with. About food, which was where Claire became unexpectedly voluble more than she intended, more than she'd been with another person in longer than she could trace. Talking about recipes and techniques and why getting a pie crust right required a specific kind of patience that most people didn't have. Gideon listened. Not the way people listen when they're waiting for their turn to talk. The way people listen who find the thing being said genuinely interesting. His attention was complete in a way that should have felt like pressure, and instead felt like relief, like being somewhere sufficiently lit at last. "You cook professionally?" he asked. "No, I work at an insurance company." Something moved across his face. Not pity, which she would have shut down immediately, just a kind of quiet attention to the gap between what she'd just described and what she'd been talking about for the last hour. "I always wanted to," she said. "A bakery. There was a time I had plans. Real plans written down. But she stopped. Things happened. What kind of things? The kind where you keep putting your own thing on hold because someone else needs something, and then one day you look up and 20 years are gone." He didn't say anything to that. He looked at his coffee cup and then back at her and said, "I know that kind of thing." She believed him, though she couldn't have said why. 3 days passed. The car was retrieved and diagnosed the alternator, which would cost more than Claire had in her checking account, and which she was going to have to put on a credit card and spend 4 months paying off. She didn't say this. She thanked the man who told her, one of Gideon's people, a quiet man named Tassus who had the hands of someone who knew engines. She should have gone home. She kept finding reasons to stay another hour. The library had a book she hadn't seen in years. Margaret was making soup and needed someone to chop vegetables. The light was bad for driving. The reasons were thin, and she knew it, and she stayed anyway. On the third evening, Gideon found her sitting in the entrance hall, with her coat on and her bag at her feet. He stopped. "Leaving," he said. "Not a question. I've already stayed too long." He leaned against the wall opposite her with his arms crossed, in the way that was already starting to feel like one of his positions not closed off, just contained. "You apologized twice this morning for taking up space in a house with 14 rooms." 12, she said. 14. There are 2 you haven't seen." He looked at her. "Where are you going? Home." "And then what?" She opened her mouth and closed it. "You don't have an answer," he said.
"I have an apartment and a job and a life, Gideon."
"I know that. That's an answer. It's a description," he said. "It's not an answer." She stood up and picked up her bag. He didn't move from the wall, didn't block her, just looked at her with that complete attention that she was already learning to brace for. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping, for all of this. I don't know what I would have done. You would have figured something out. Maybe. No, maybe. You would have." He said it with certainty, the way he said most things, not to be kind, but because he appeared to believe it. "Come back when you're ready." She looked at him. "To the library," he said. Not quite neutral. Not quite not, she left. The drive home took 40 minutes through cleared roads under a gray January sky, and Claire spent most of it thinking about the tilted lamp and the way he listened and the sentence she'd said about 20 years being gone, and the fact that he hadn't offered to fix it or reframe it or suggest she looked at it wrong. Just said, "I know that kind of thing." She went back to work. Insurance claims. The same desk she'd sat at for 9 years. The same fluorescent light above it that flickered slightly on cold mornings. The same commute. The same Tuesday meetings where nobody said anything that couldn't have been an email. She was good at her job in the way that people are good at things they could do in their sleep, efficiently, reliably, invisibly. She had been invisible her whole life. She was very good at it. Her mother called on the 3rd of January. Claire watched the phone ring and then answered it, because she always answered it, because not answering required a kind of sustained intention she'd never quite managed. "I've been worried sick," Judith said, which was not an apology and was not meant to be. It was an opening position. "You disappeared on Christmas Eve. Nobody knew where you were. I was fine. You didn't call. My phone was dead." She paused. "You could have called earlier. In the month of December, or November, or at any point when nothing was wrong." Silence on the line. Then I know you were upset. Yes, but what you said in front of everyone was very hurtful. Claire sat down on her couch. She looked at the ceiling. I said there wasn't a chair for me at the table. You made a scene. I named a fact. Claire. Her mother's voice shifted into the particular register that had governed Claire's entire childhood, patient, slightly pained, the voice of someone managing an inconvenient problem. Your father and I worked very hard to give you girls everything you needed. You gave Mallory everything she needed. I got what was left. She said it without heat, which surprised her. Just flat and clear. That's not me being dramatic. That's just what happened. Another silence. Longer this time. Well, Judith said finally, Mallory is very upset. I know, she's been crying. Mom, Mallory cries when her coffee order is wrong. That's not a barometer of who was wronged here. You were always jealous of your sister. I was at her house at 7 in the morning on Christmas. I made everything on that table, and she didn't know there wasn't a chair for me. Claire's voice was steady, and she did not know how. Either she didn't notice or she didn't care, and I'm not sure which is worse. The silence this time had a different quality. I'd like to see you, Judith said, finally. Less certain. We should talk properly. Yes, Claire agreed. We should, but not yet. She hung up before the conversation could continue. Her phone buzzed 4 minutes later. A text from Mallory. Mom says you're still angry. Can we please just move past this? It's not good for the family. Claire put the phone face down on the coffee table. The family. She had spent 41 years being the infrastructure of that family, the one who remembered the details and absorbed the labor and made the phone calls and showed up and cooked and cleaned and never required anything as inconvenient as a seat at the table. And now that she had named the thing out loud, the conversation had somehow become about whether she could stop being angry quickly enough not to inconvenience everyone. She left the phone face down for a long time. She went back to Ashbourne Manor on a Saturday in late January. She didn't announce it. She drove out, parked at the gate, pressed the intercom, and after a pause long enough that she had decided she'd made an error and was in the process of calculating how to leave gracefully, Gideon's voice came through. Library? If that's still gates opening. It's opening. She spent 4 hours in the library reading a history of New England bakeries that had been printed in 1987 and was more interesting than it had any right to be. Gideon worked at a desk in the corner, reading things she didn't ask about, occasionally making calls in a low voice that she couldn't hear and didn't try to. Margaret brought at 2 and tea at 4, and each time seemed unsurprised to find Claire there, as though her presence had already been incorporated into the schedule. She came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. A sound like green wood splitting. It was on the third Saturday in the library when Gideon set down whatever he was reading and looked at her for long enough that she looked up from her book. Your mother called here, he said. Claire went very still. This morning. She got the number somehow. I don't know how. He said it without inflection, but something in his stillness suggested the how was something he was already looking into. She wanted to know if you were here. I told her that was your business. What else did she say? That the family was concerned. That you'd been acting unlike yourself. That she thought perhaps you were going through something difficult and had attached to inappropriate people. Claire heard that word. Inappropriate. Heard it land in the specific place her mother had always known how to reach. She said that. Yes. And your response that. If she had questions about her daughter, she might try asking her daughter. He paused. She didn't seem to find that useful. Claire set down her book. She looked at the ceiling, and then at the tilted lamp, and then at Gideon, who was watching her with that steady attention that didn't ask for anything back. I'm sorry, she said. That she called here. That's... Don't what? Apologize for your mother calling here as though you made the call. She stopped. He leaned forward slightly. That's what you do. Something happens that isn't your fault. Because you've spent so long managing other people's reactions that you apologize preventively to get ahead of the blame before it arrives. The accuracy of it was almost physical. She didn't say anything. It's a habit, he said, not a character flaw. But it's a habit that's costing you something. You learned a lot about me in 3 Saturdays. I learned that in the first 3 days. He said it simply. I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place. And now it is? Now you've been coming to my library for a month. So he sat back, yes. The following week, Mallory's husband Derek emailed Gideon directly. Claire only knew this because Gideon showed her the email, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with his phone turned toward her. She read it twice. Derek's email was professional in the way of someone who is not, professionally smooth in places, jagged in others, the pitch of someone who had done a quick calculation and decided the numbers made sense. He had heard, he wrote, that his sister-in-law was spending time at Ashbourne Manor. He wanted to reach out, one professional to another, about a business matter that he thought might interest a man of Gideon's resources. He named a number. He named a project. He suggested dinner. Did he know who you were? Claire asked. He knows is enough. He knows the name. Gideon's voice was even. He looked it up after Christmas and decided the risk was manageable. He's asking you for money. He's offering me an investment opportunity. The quotation marks were audible. It amounts to the same thing. Claire put the phone down on the table. Something cold was moving through her chest. She stopped. Started again. Did my mother tell him I was coming here? Someone did. She thought about her mother calling. About Mallory's text. About the word inappropriate. She thought about the speed of it, how quickly. Once her family understood that she was near something of value, the reconnection had begun. Not with an apology, not with reckoning or acknowledgement or the specific phrase she had been waiting her whole life to hear. With a business inquiry. They're not worried about me, she said. No. They're worried about what I might have access to. Gideon said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. I want to see them, she said. I need to know if I'm wrong. I need to sit in a room with them and look at them and know for sure. He looked at her for a moment. All right, you think that's a bad idea. I think it's your idea, he said. Those aren't the same thing. She arranged to meet her parents and Mallory for lunch in town the following Thursday. Neutral ground, a restaurant she chose, a time she set. She drove herself and arrived first and sat at the table and ordered water and waited. They came together, all three of them, which she hadn't expected, and which immediately told her something about the formation they'd taken, the way they'd caucused before this. Judith hugged her. Howard kissed her cheek. Mallory said, "You look thin," in the voice that meant she'd been coached to lead with concern. They sat down. For 20 minutes, it went the way these things go, careful, warm on the surface, full of the language of family when family is performing rather than functioning. They asked about her apartment. They said they'd missed her. Judith said she'd been making Claire's favorite soup, which was not actually Claire's favorite soup, and never had been. It was Mallory's. But Claire had stopped correcting this so long ago that the error had calcified into family mythology. Then Howard cleared his throat and said casually, as though it had just occurred to him, I understand you've been spending time with Gideon Ashbourne. Yes, he's a very well. He's a significant figure in the county. Howard chose words with the specific care of a man, trying not to say something specific. We just want to make sure you're being careful. Careful, Claire said. He's not exactly, he runs in certain circles, Claire. We've heard things. What things? Howard looked at Judith. Judith looked at her hands. Mallory picked up her water glass. We just want what's best for you, Mallory said, and there it was. The sentence, the one that meant nothing. The something, the one that had covered everything for 41 years, every time they'd taken from her and called it love. Every time they'd needed something and called it closeness. Every time they'd made her small and called it family. We just want what's best for you. Derek emailed Gideon, Claire said. Quietly, clearly, for money. Did you know that? Mallory's face went through several things quickly. He mentioned he was going to reach out, she started. For money, Claire said, while you were all very concerned about my welfare. While Mom was calling Ashbourne Manor to find out if I was there. While she looked at her mother told me I looked unwell and that I'd attached to inappropriate people. She stopped. You're not worried about me. You're managing me. There's a difference. The restaurant was not loud enough. That is not, Judith began. Mallory got every opportunity in this family. Claire's voice was completely level, which frightened her slightly. College, funded. The house helped with the down payment. The loan when Derek's first business failed. I got a birthday card most years. She looked at her father. When did you last call me, Dad? Not because you needed something. When did you call? Because you were curious how I was. Howard's jaw tightened. I'm not asking for an apology right now, Claire said. I'm not sure what an apology looks like from this family. But I need you to understand that I understand what this lunch is. It's not reconciliation, it's reconnaissance. She put her napkin on the table. She picked up her purse. She left $30 under her water glass for the drink she'd had and the one she'd ordered and never touched, and she walked out of the restaurant into the thin winter sun, and she stood on the sidewalk, outside, and breathed the cold air, and understood that she was not going back to that table. Not today. Not next week. Maybe not ever, if they couldn't find a way to be people who were actually sorry for anything at all. She drove back to Ashbourne Manor. She didn't plan to. Her hands drove there, the way hands go toward what they know. Gideon was in the small sitting room with the tilted lamp when Margaret showed her in. He looked up from whatever he was reading, and he looked at her face, and he set the thing down and said nothing, just waited. It was what you thought it was, she said. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. You didn't do anything wrong. She heard herself say it, and almost laughed. I'm doing the thing, a little. She sat down in the chair across from him. She was holding her bag in her lap too tightly, so she put it on the floor. The lamp threw its familiar, tilted light across the left side of his face. There are notebooks, she said, at my apartment. I've had them since I was 19. Recipes. Plans for a bakery I was going to open. She looked at the lamp. I need to go get them. He looked at her. Because I think I need to do something with them, she said. I think I've waited long enough. Something shifted in his face, not a smile exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that was a smile in the same way a pilot light is a fire. I think you might be right, he said. She drove home that evening, with her hands steady on the wheel and the road clear and dark ahead of her, and she walked into her apartment and went straight to the closet shelf, where 3 worn notebooks sat behind a box of old tax documents, and she pulled them down and sat on the floor with them in her lap. The first page of the first notebook was dated 22 years ago. Her handwriting from back then was different, faster, looser, the handwriting of someone who believed she had time to refine things later. She turned the pages slowly. 22 years of recipes. 22 years of annotated margins, revised measurements, notes to herself in 3 different pens about what worked and what didn't and why. A whole creative life she had been conducting in secret, in the hours nobody needed anything, in the space between being useful. She sat on the floor of her apartment, and she turned every page, and by the time she got to the last one, a recipe she had written out 2 months ago, a lemon cake with a cardamom glaze that she had made twice in her own kitchen, and both times uneaten standing at the counter, because there was no one to share it with, she understood something that she should have understood a long time ago. This was the thing that was hers. This has always been the thing that was hers. And the only reason it was still sitting in a closet behind a box of tax documents was that she had spent 41 years believing that what was hers had to wait until everyone else was finished with her. She closed the last notebook. She looked at the 3 of them stacked in her lap. She had been waiting for permission. She understood now, sitting on the floor of her apartment with her whole buried life in her hands, that the permission was never going to come from anyone who had ever asked her to eat in the kitchen. And the only question that remained, the one she was going to have to answer, the one that had no safe answer and no going back, once she answered it was whether she was finally ready to stop. She brought the notebooks to Ashbourne Manor on a Tuesday. Not Saturday, not the scheduled library day she had somehow fallen into over the past 2 months, but Tuesday. She had spent Sunday and Monday reading through every page again at her kitchen table, and by Monday night she understood that if she waited until Saturday, she would find a reason to put them back on the shelf. Margaret let her in without comment, which was one of Margaret's most valuable qualities. Gideon was in the kitchen when she got there, standing at the counter with a coffee cup and a newspaper, actual newspaper, printed, folded, and he looked up when she came in, and his eyes went to the notebooks under her arm and stayed there for a moment before going back to her face. Tuesday, he said. I know it's not Saturday. You can come on Tuesday. He set down the coffee. You can come on any day. She put the notebooks on the kitchen table. 3 of them, stacked. Worn covers, the kind of soft from handling that comes from years of the same hands on the same object. She had carried them in her bag for years, whenever she moved apartments, not because she planned to do anything with them, but because she couldn't leave them. I want to show you something, she said. He sat down at the table across from the notebooks, but didn't touch them. Waiting. She opened the first one to a page. She had marked a recipe for a brown butter almond cake with the sea salt caramel she had developed when she was 24, working 3 nights on the proportions until it was right. She turned it toward him. He read it. Not skimmed read the way he read everything, with actual attention. There are more like this, he asked. 3 notebooks worth. He looked up at her. Can I? She nodded. He went through the first notebook slowly. Then the second. She made herself coffee and stood at the counter and watched him, which was uncomfortable in a way she sat with rather than deflecting. His face gave very little away while he was reading, but she had learned to watch for the small things, the slight forward lean when something caught him, the moment his hand hovered before turning a page, as though he wasn't quite done. He was on the 3rd notebook for a long time. When he closed it, he set it on the stack with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something that has just been reclassified. Claire, he said, I know they're just recipes. They're not just recipes. Gideon, stop. He said it quietly, but it stopped her. Stop doing that. Stop saying something is just a thing before anyone has had the chance to tell you it's worth something more. He looked at her steadily. These are extraordinary. You know they're extraordinary. That's why you've kept them for 22 years. She looked at the notebooks. I own a property on Hawthorne Avenue, he said. It's been empty for 14 months. Commercial space, professional kitchen, corner location, large windows. He paused. It's yours if you want it. The offer landed on her like something dropped from height. She opened her mouth and he held up one hand, not to silence her, just to slow her down. Before you say no, he said. I was going to say I can't accept that. I know. Before you explain why you can't accept it, think about the actual reason. Not the reason that sounds responsible. The real one. The real one was that accepting something this large felt like debt. Like the beginning of an obligation. Like the first brick in a wall that would eventually become a room she couldn't leave. She said this, not in those words, but in words close enough. Gideon listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then he said, there's no debt. There's no obligation. I have a property that's sitting empty, and I'm offering it to you because I've read 3 notebooks, and I understand what happens if you don't do this. He leaned forward slightly. You go back to your desk at the insurance company, and you put these on a shelf, and you wait. For what, I don't know. Another 22 years, maybe. Until someone gives you permission. Until someone notices. Until the right moment arrives, which it won't, because the right moment is the one you make. The kitchen was quiet. I don't know how to run a business, she said. You know how to bake. The rest you learn. What if I fail? What if you don't? She looked at the stack of notebooks on his table. 22 years of the one thing she had never let anyone see. Because letting people see the thing that mattered meant accepting what it felt like when they didn't care. She accepted the property. She said yes in the same way she had opened the car door in the snowstorm, not with certainty, but with the exhaustion of someone who has run out of reasons to keep saying no. She named the bakery, the empty chair. She told Gideon the name at the kitchen table, and he looked at her for a long moment and said, that's exactly right, and she understood he meant it, and that was the end of the naming discussion. The renovation took 6 weeks. Gideon had contractors who worked efficiently and without requiring Claire's constant supervision, which was fortunate because she was simultaneously working her notice at the insurance company 4 weeks, during which her manager asked 3 times if she was sure, and she said yes, 3 times, and the 3rd time her manager looked at her with the expression of someone watching a person jump from a plane and hoping they have a parachute. She had a parachute. She had 3 notebooks and a kitchen on Hawthorne Avenue, and a man who had looked at her recipes the way she had always needed someone to look at them. She was terrified. The terror was different from what she expected. She had thought fear would feel like the old fear, the fear of taking up too much space, of wanting too much, of failing publicly, and having people know she had believed in herself and been wrong. That fear was quiet and deflating. This fear was loud, energetic, the kind that lives in the chest like something trying to get out. She worked 18-hour days in the weeks before opening. She tested every recipe from the notebooks, the ones she knew by heart, and the ones she hadn't made in years, and refined and adjusted and made the decisions about what the menu would be and what it wouldn't. She had arguments with herself at 2 in the morning about whether the caramel tart was too ambitious for an opening menu and whether the lemon cake, the one she had made for Gideon in his kitchen that night, should be the signature item. It should be the signature item. She knew this by the third test batch. Gideon came by the bakery on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks before opening, when the renovation was finished and the kitchen was installed, but the front of the shop was still half empty. He walked through the space with the contained, observant manner of someone conducting an assessment, touching things briefly, the counter edge, the window ledge, the door handle, and when he got to the back where she was working, he looked at the kitchen and then at her. "This is real," he said. "Why does everyone sound surprised when they say that?" "Because you spent 41 years acting like your life was temporary." She set down the spatula she was holding. He was standing in the doorway of her kitchen, the one she had designed from the notebooks, up, and he was looking at her with something that wasn't quite the steady attention she'd come to know. Something more unguarded. "You're different," he said. "From 3 months ago. Or good different, no hesitation. You don't apologize when you walk into a room anymore." She thought about that. "I didn't notice, I did." A sound slit, Greenwood splitting. They stood in the kitchen looking at each other, and something that had been building quietly since Christmas Eve moved close enough to the surface that she could feel it, and she thought, "Not yet." And she thought, "But eventually," and she thought, "Yes." She opened the empty chair on a Thursday in March. The first week was slow in the way of all beginnings, a trickle of customers, some curious and some confused, a few who became immediate regulars in the way that certain people find a place and immediately understand it belongs to them. She sold out of the lemon cake on the first day, which she had not expected, and had to put a handwritten sign on the case by noon that said "More tomorrow." The sign became a running joke among the regulars before the end of the first month. The food columnist arrived on a Thursday in April. Claire didn't know who she was. The woman was in her early 60s, well-dressed, and ate alone at the small table near the window, and she ordered the lemon cake and a coffee and sat for 40 minutes, and when she left she said to Claire at the counter, "I'll be in touch," which meant nothing to Claire at the time. The review published the following week. The headline called, "The Lemon Cake, the Most Honest Thing I Have Eaten. 5 years of writing about food in Connecticut." The paragraph about the empty chair, its name, its origin, the woman who ran it, was 7 sentences long and made Claire's phone start ringing at 7 in the morning and not stop for 2 days. She was not ready for it. She was also not destroyed by it, which was the thing she discovered about herself in those first mad weeks after the review. The old Claire, the one who had spent 41 years keeping the lights low so as not to attract the wrong kind of attention, would have buckled, would have found a way to minimize it, apologize for the success, defer to someone else's comfort. The new Claire, the one who had driven to Ashbourne Manor on a Tuesday with 3 notebooks under her arm, looked at the line outside her door at 7:30 on a Saturday morning and felt something pure and clean and entirely her own. She was doing this. She was actually doing this. It was in the 4th week after the review, on a morning when the line was already 6 people long before she unlocked the door, that Genevieve Lockwood walked in. Claire did not know the name. Not at first. She knew the type. She had grown up in Briar Glen, and she understood certain women in it. Women whose families had been significant in this town, long enough that significance had become identity, who wore their money the way other people wore a surname. This woman came in on a Tuesday when the shop was not crowded, sat at the counter, and ordered a black coffee. She looked at the space for a while. Then she looked at Claire. "You're her," she said, not unkindly, just factual. "I'm Claire. I own the shop. You're the woman staying at Ashbourne Manor." Claire looked at her. "I'm not staying there anymore. I have my own apartment." "But you were." The woman tilted her head slightly. Gideon mentioned you. You know Gideon. For a long time, she sipped her coffee. I'm Genevieve Lockwood. Our families have been adjacent for many years. Adjacent. The word was a choice. Claire filed it. He seems happy, Genevieve said. Happier than I've seen him in a long time. It's good to hear. I'm sure it is. She set down her cup with a precision that was too deliberate to be casual. I just want to say this plainly, since I think plain is more respectful. Gideon and I have a history that goes further back than most people know. There was a time when our families expected us to end up together. That didn't happen, for reasons that are complicated. But he, as she paused, choosing. He is not a simple person. His life is not a simple life. And the women who pass through it don't always understand that until they're already in it. Claire looked at her. I appreciate the honesty, Claire said. Here's mine. I'm not passing through anything. I opened a bakery. I'm good at it. Whatever I have with Gideon is between me and him. She picked up the coffee carafe. More coffee? Genevieve looked at her for a moment, with an expression that could have been assessment or surprise, or something that was almost respect. Then she said no, thank you. She left. Claire stood at the counter after the door closed and breathed. She was not shaken. That was the thing she noted, the thing she held very carefully because she didn't trust it yet. She was not shaken. Genevieve Lockwood had walked into her space and done the thing people do when they want to make you feel like a visitor in your own life, and Claire had stayed exactly where she was. She told Gideon about the visit that evening when he came in near closing. He stood at the counter with his coat still on and listened, and when she was done, he was quiet for a moment. She came here, he said. Yes, I'll talk to her. I already handled it. He looked at her. Something moved in his face. I know, he said. I know you did. He said it as though that fact was something he was still in the process of understanding. That's not what I mean. What she said to you was her being territorial about something that isn't hers. Claire stacked the last of the clean plates with a deliberateness she was aware of. I'm not threatened by history. No, he said. You're not. And then because Gideon Ashbourne said things the way he decided to say them without a lot of preamble, I'm in love with you. The plate she was holding stayed in her hands. He didn't say it again. He didn't walk it back.
He stood at the counter with his coat on,
And his hands still at his sides, and looked at her with the complete attention that was his particular way of being present, and waited. I know, she said, that's all. I know, she said again. And you know, she stopped. Put the plate down. I need you to understand something first, before I say it back. I need you to know that I know this isn't a transaction. That it doesn't come with a ledger, that you can't give me a bakery and a library and 3 months of actually being seen, and then expect that She stopped again. Not because she didn't know what she meant, but because what she meant was very large. I don't expect anything, he said. I know you don't. She looked at him. That's part of why I love you. The kitchen behind her was still warm, still smelled like the day's baking, and the front windows were dark with early evening, and Claire stood in the thing she had made and said the sentence out loud. For the first time. And it was the least frightened she had been by anything in a very long time. Then her phone rang. She glanced at it out of habit. Mallory. She was going to let it go to voicemail. She had gotten better at this, but something in the consecutive nature of it made her look again. Mallory had called twice in the last 3 minutes. I have to take this, she said. Gideon nodded. He moved toward the other end of the counter to give her room. She answered. Mallory's voice was different. Not the managed warmth she had used in the restaurant, not the calibrated concern of the text messages. Raw in a way Claire hadn't heard since they were children. Claire, pause. Breath, something happened. What? Dad he had a cardiac event this afternoon. He's at Briar Glen General. They say he's stable, but Mom is, her voice fractured. Can you come? Claire stood in her bakery with the phone against her ear. I'll be there, she said. She hung up and looked at Gideon. My father, she said. Hospital. Go. He was already picking up her coat from the hook near the door where she always hung it. I'll close the shop. You don't know how to close the shop. Margaret will talk me through it. She took the coat. He held the door. She got to Briar Glen General in 20 minutes and found her mother in a waiting room chair with the specific deflation The specific of a woman whose certainty about how the world operates has just been interrupted. Judith looked older in the fluorescent light, smaller. She looked up when Claire came in, and something crossed her face that was not the usual armor. "He's stable," Judith said immediately. "They say he's going to be fine." A blockage. "They're doing something tonight," and then she stopped. Her hands were in her lap, and they were not still. Claire sat down next to her mother. She did not say, "I'm here," or "everything will be fine." She just sat. Mallory arrived 15 minutes later with Derek and the children, and the waiting room became fuller and louder in the specific way of family emergency. A sound like green wood splitting, and Claire understood in the middle of it and understood something about herself. She was still working out the edges of she was here because Howard was her father, not because the family had earned her presence. That distinction was important. She was here for him, not for the relationship. Not because coming would make things easier. Because he was her father, and he was sick, and she was the kind of person who showed up for that, regardless. She was not going to let them turn it into something else. Howard came through the procedure. The cardiologist explained it in the hallway. At 10:30 that night, a man of around 50 who used precise language and repeated himself when Judith failed to parse the first explanation. He was going to be fine. Diet changes, medication, rest. "Fine," Judith cried. Mallory cried. Derek shook hands with the doctor, in a way that suggested he thought handshakes were appropriate here. Claire stood in the hallway and breathed. She was allowed to see her father briefly, alone, after the others had gone. He was in bed with the particular diminishment that hospital gowns impose on people who are accustomed to being physically impressive. Howard Whitcomb had always carried himself with a certain solidity, and seeing him without it was its own specific shock. He looked at her when she came in. "You came," he said. "Of course I came." He looked at the ceiling. His hands on the blanket were older than she usually let herself notice. "Your sister said you might not. Given everything." Mallory was wrong. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been wrong about a lot of things, Claire." She looked at him. "I know." He didn't say it with drama. He said it with the exhausted simplicity of a man who has spent an afternoon thinking he might be dying and has taken stock. "I know I've been wrong. I don't know how to fix it. I'm not sure you can fix something that went on that long." He turned his head to look at her. "But I wanted you to know I know." She sat in the chair beside his bed. "Okay," she said. "That's all?" "For now," she said. "Get some rest. We can talk about the rest when you're out of here." She drove home at midnight. She was tired in the specific full-body way of emotional days. The kind where you have felt too many different things, and the body starts to refuse further input. She parked outside her apartment building and sat in the car for a minute. Her phone had a text from Gideon. "Shop is closed and locked. Margaret sends her regards. Come by when you're ready." She texted back, "Tomorrow. And thank you." She went inside and went to bed and slept without dreaming. And in the morning, the bakery opened at 7, was there at 5:30, and she was there in SA6 and the lemon cake went in the oven at 6, and by 7 the sign in the window was turned to open, and everything was exactly where she had put it. This was the life she had made. It was 3 weeks later that the first crack appeared in it. A Saturday, busy the kind of Saturday, that had become the standard since the review when the line showed up before she unlocked the door. She had hired 2 people, by this point, a young woman named Dara, who baked with genuine skill, and a quiet man in his 30s named Luisis, who worked the counter with an efficiency that Claire recognized and valued. She was in the kitchen at 10 in the morning when Margaret appeared in the back doorway. Claire looked up from the pastry she was working. "Margaret." She registered the expressions. "What happened?" "There's a woman out front," Margaret said. "Asking for you. She's not a customer." "Who is she?" Margaret's face did a careful thing. "She says she's a journalist." Claire wiped her hands on her apron. "What kind of journalist?" "The kind with a recorder," Margaret said. "And questions about Gideon." The cold came back. The specific cold she had first felt in the restaurant with her family, when she understood what the lunch was actually for. She came out to the front of the shop. The woman was standing near the door, mid-30s, practical clothes, a phone in her hand, and a small recording device she made no effort to conceal. She had the look of someone who had decided to be direct as a strategic choice. "Ms. Whitcomb," she said. "That's me. My name is Sandra Reeve. I write for the Hartford Monitor. I've been covering Gideon Ashbourne's business operations for the past 8 months," she said it cleanly. "I'd like to talk to you about your relationship with him." The shop had gone quiet in the specific way of a small space when something is happening. Dara, behind the counter, was looking at her pastry case too carefully. A customer at the corner table had stopped pretending to read her phone. "Why don't you step outside?" Claire said. They stood on the sidewalk. The March air was cold and direct. "What do you want to know?" Claire asked. "How long have you known him?" "Since December, around Christmas." "And you're aware of his business interests? The full scope of them?" Claire looked at her. "I'm aware that his life is complicated." "Ms. Whitcomb." The journalist held her gaze. "Gideon Ashbourne has been under federal investigation for 18 months. Financial crimes, racketeering, connections to organized crime operations that span 3 states." She paused. "Deliberate. The investigation is entering an active phase. There are people in his organization who are cooperating with federal prosecutors. Within the next few weeks, it's very likely that people close to him are going to face serious scrutiny." Claire stood on the sidewalk of Hawthorne Avenue, outside the bakery she had opened 6 weeks ago. "The property he gave you," the journalist continued, careful and precise as a scalpel. "It was purchased 11 years ago through a shell company with documented ties to money laundering operations. Which means this building, your bakery, Ms. Whitcomb, is potentially subject to asset forfeiture if the investigation concludes the way federal prosecutors believe it will." The street was loud around them, with ordinary Saturday morning sounds, and Claire heard none of them. "They could take the building," the journalist said. "They probably will." Claire looked at the sign above her own door. The empty chair, the word she had chosen. The name she had given the thing she built from nothing, from notebooks on a closet shelf, from 22 years of believing she might someday be allowed to want something and keep it. She heard every word the journalist said, and she did not look away from the sign, and she understood that the road that was supposed to have punished her, the cold road, on Christmas Eve, the broken car, the stranger in the expensive sedan had led her here, to this, to the one thing that had ever truly been hers. And now it was about to be taken, not by her family this time, by the weight of a life she had walked into without asking enough questions, because asking questions had never been something she was allowed to do when the warmth was finally real, and the light was finally on, and someone was finally looking at her and seeing something worth seeing. She turned back to the journalist. "What are you asking me to do?" she said. The journalist's expression was careful, deliberate, and absolutely certain that she had Claire Whitcomb's complete, undivided attention. Sandra Reeve wanted a story. That was the thing Claire understood standing on that sidewalk with the cold coming off the street and her own sign visible above the journalist's left shoulder. Not information, not justice, not the public interest in the abstract way journalists like to invoke when they wanted something specific from someone specific. A story. One with a woman in it who had been given things by a powerful man and either didn't know what the things cost or did know and accepted them anyway. Either version worked for Sandra Reeve. Claire could see her deciding which version Claire was going to be. "I'm not asking you to do anything," Sandra said. "I'm informing you of a situation that affects you directly. What you do with that information is your business. But you're recording this conversation." A pause. "I am. And if I say something useful to your story, you'll use it. That's how journalism works." Claire looked at the recorder. Small, black, unpretentious, the kind of object that had ended things before. "Turn it off." Sandra's expression moved through something brief. "Ms. Whitcomb, turn it off or I go back inside and you can stand out here as long as you like." Sandra turned it off. She did it slowly, showing Claire the screen as she did it, which Claire noted and didn't fully trust. "The building," Claire said. "Walk me through what you said." Specifically, the property on Hawthorne Avenue was purchased in 2013 through a company called Aldrich Holdings, LLC. Aldrich Holdings has been identified in the federal investigation as a financial instrument. It was used to move money from Ashbourne's criminal operations into legitimate real estate assets. When the investigation concludes and those assets are seized, everything Aldrich Holdings owns becomes subject to forfeiture, including this address, the bakery itself, the business, the building, which means your lease, your equipment, your permits, all of it contingent on an address you no longer have access to. You could sue, probably wouldn't succeed. Federal asset forfeiture law is, she made a gesture that was both economical and devastating. Difficult. Claire looked at the sidewalk. How long, she said. Before the forfeiture? Could be weeks. Could be less, depending on when prosecutors move. And Gideon knows this. Sandra's expression did something careful. That's a question I'd very much like to hear you answer. Claire looked at her directly. That wasn't an answer, sir. I asked if Gideon knows the status of this property. Based on what we've found, Sandra said yes. He would have known when he transferred it to you. The sidewalk held Claire's weight. The building behind her held everything she had built. She breathed in cold air, and she thought about a kitchen table in January with 3 notebooks on it, and a man who had read every page, and what he had said, I have a property on Hawthorne Avenue. She thought about how quickly he had offered it. She thought about the way he had looked at her when she said yes. She didn't know what any of it meant yet. She knew it was too large to understand standing on a sidewalk with a journalist watching her face. I have nothing to say to you right now, Claire said. I understand. If I change my mind, I'll find you. Claire held out her hand. Cards. Sandra gave her one. Claire looked at it, put it in her apron pocket, and went back inside. Dara was pretending to clean a counter that was already clean. The customer in the corner had given up on the phone performance and was watching openly. Luis was at the register with a face that revealed nothing, because Luis had the gift of a man who had seen enough of the world not to be rattled by its complications. We're fine, Claire said to no one in particular. To all of them. She went to the back kitchen and stood at her prep table and put both hands flat on the stainless steel surface and breathed. She called Gideon. He picked up on the second ring. Claire, I need to see you today. Now, if possible. A pause that was half a second too long. Come to the manor. I'm at the bakery until 2. I'll come there. No, she said it before she knew she was going to. Something in her needed the ground of this conversation to be neutral, not his house, not anywhere his name already owned. There's a coffee shop on Meridian. Farrell's. Can you be there at 2:30? Another pause. Yes. She hung up and went back to work because the alternative was standing in her kitchen for 4 hours, doing nothing but frightening herself. And she had rolls to finish and a lunch service to get through. And she was, whatever else was happening, someone who showed up. She showed up. She got through the service. She got through the lunch rush and the 2 o'clock slowdown, and she handed off to Dara and Luis, with instructions she repeated twice because her mind was doing a thing she was trying to keep contained, and she walked to Farrell's on Meridian and got there 8 minutes early and sat in a booth in the back where she could see the door. Gideon came in at 2:30 exactly. He saw her before she raised her hand. He always did. Had some quality of attention that meant he located the people he was looking for quickly, efficiently, the way of someone trained by necessity to understand a room. He came to the booth and sat across from her, and he looked at her face, and he did not say anything immediately. That told her something. A journalist came to the shop today, Claire said. Sandra Reeve. The name came out of him without hesitation, without surprise. You know her, Claire said. I know of her. She's been on this story for a while. She told me about the federal investigation. Claire kept her voice low and level with an effort she was aware of. She told me about Aldrich Holdings. She told me what the property on Hawthorne Avenue is connected to. Gideon's face was still. Not the still of someone concealing a reaction, the still of someone who has been still through worse things than this and knows how to hold it. Say something, she said. What do you want me to say? I want you to tell me you didn't know. Her voice cracked on the last word, not with emotion, but with the physical effort of keeping it together. When you gave me that building, I want you to tell me you didn't know it was going to be seized. He was quiet. The coffee shop was warm and smelled like espresso, and someone near the window was laughing at something on their phone, and the world outside was completely ordinary in a way that felt obscene. Gideon, the investigation was at an earlier stage when I gave you the property, he said. The Aldrich Holdings connection, I knew it was complicated. I believed there was time, that I could resolve it before. He stopped. Before it became my problem. He looked at her directly. Yes. You gave me a building that you knew might be taken from me. I gave you a building I intended to protect from being taken. But you didn't tell me. Her hands were flat on the table, and she was not going to lift them, because if she lifted them, she was not sure what they would do. You didn't say, Claire. This property has a complicated history. There are some legal issues I'm working to resolve. Here are the risks you should know before you put your name on it and quit your job and give 6 weeks of your life to building something inside it. She stopped. Breathed. You didn't say any of that. No, he said. Why? The word came out smaller than she intended, and she hated it, hated the way it sounded like a wound. Because she was not going to be wounded by this. She was going to be clear-eyed and present, and not the woman who fell apart because a man had been less than honest about a building. Because, he said, and he said it quietly, I thought I could fix it. I thought I could handle it before it became real to you. I've been handling things for a long time, and he stopped himself. That's not an excuse. I'm not going to tell you it was complicated and expect that to land as an explanation. Then what are you going to tell me? He leaned forward, his elbows on the table and his hands together and his eyes on hers, with the full weight of that attention that she had come to know as one of the most honest things about him. That I'm sorry, that I should have told you, that the reason I didn't isn't complicated. I wanted you to have it without the weight of it. I wanted to give you something clean, and it wasn't clean to begin with, and I made the decision to manage that without telling you. He paused. I was wrong. She looked at him. The building might be taken, she said. I have lawyers working on it. There are structures ways to establish that the transfer to you was legitimate and arm's length, that the business itself is separate from. Might be taken, she said again. Yes or no? Might be. His jaw tightened. Yes, she sat back. She sat back, and she looked at the ceiling of Farrell's coffee shop, and she thought about the empty chair and the sign above the door and the lemon cake and the notebooks and the food columnist's 7 sentences and the line on Saturday mornings and Dara and Luis and all of it, all of the things she had built in 6 weeks from 22 years of waiting, and she understood that it might be gone. Not because of her family, this time, because she had trusted someone else's word about something that should have been hers to decide. I need some time, she said. Claire, not forever. She made herself look at him. I'm not done with you. I don't think. But I need to think, and I can't think with you in the room right now. He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded. Once. Controlled and real. She left first. She walked back to the bakery in the cold and went into her kitchen and stood there until the shaking in her hands stopped. And then she picked up the phone and called the only lawyer she knew, a woman she had worked with at the insurance company who had left to go into private practice 3 years ago, and left a message that was professional and direct and contained. None of what she was actually feeling, and when she hung up, she put on her apron and finished the afternoon prep, because tomorrow was Sunday, and Sunday was her biggest day, and she was not going to let this take Sunday. The lawyer, whose name was Beth Corwin, called back that evening. Beth listened to the whole thing with the particular quality of attention that good lawyers have: not sympathy, not judgment, just the systematic collection of facts. Then she said, "Forward me everything you have. The transfer documents, the lease agreement, anything with the property address on it. I'll look at it tonight. How bad is it?" "I don't know yet." Honest. Claire appreciated it. Federal forfeiture is it can move fast, and it can be very difficult to fight. But if the transfer to you was properly documented, if the consideration was legitimate, there may be arguments. She paused. Is it? The transfer was their actual documented consideration? He gave me the building, Claire said, as a gift. A silence on the line. That's the harder argument, Beth said. Claire spent Sunday in the bakery. She made everything by hand that morning, the cakes, the rolls, every pastry in the case, with a focus that was almost meditative in its intensity. her hands moving through processes they knew by heart, while her mind worked the problem from every angle it could find. She was midway, through the second batch of the lemon cake, when she understood what she was going to do. She went to Ashbourne Manor that evening. The gate opened. It always opened. Like green wood splitting. She drove the gravel driveway through the last of the daylight and parked, and Margaret opened the door before she reached it and looked at her face and said, "He's in the study." And then in a lower voice, "He hasn't eaten." "Margaret, I'm not asking you to fix it," Margaret said. "I'm informing you." She found him in the study, which was the formal room rather than the small sitting room, the one with the desk he used for actual business, the one she'd only been in twice. He was on the phone when she came to the doorway, his back half turned, his voice low and hard, in a way she recognized as the version of him that had nothing to do with Saturday mornings in the library. He saw her. He said into the phone, "I'll call you back," and hung up. "I didn't say you could come in," he said. "Not hostile. Just noting. I didn't ask," she said, and she walked in. She sat in the chair across from the desk. He remained standing, which was fine. She had not come here to be comfortable. "I spoke to a lawyer," she said. "She thinks there may be arguments to make, to protect the business assets even if the building is seized. But she needs to know everything, the full structure of the investigation, the Aldrich Holdings documentation, everything your lawyers have." She looked at him. "I need you to give my lawyer access to your legal team. Everything they have on this property." He looked at her. "If I do that, I know what it means. It means parts of your operation become visible to someone outside your circle." She held his gaze. "I need you to do it anyway, Claire. This is the bakery," she said. "This is the thing I built. I am not going to lose it because I didn't ask hard enough. Whatever it costs you to open those files, it's less than what it costs me to walk away from that building without fighting." He looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "That's it? You're right, okay." She exhaled slowly. He came around the desk and sat in the other chair, not the desk chair, the one near the window, the position that made them level. He had the look of a man who had been doing calculations for 2 days and had arrived at a conclusion he didn't fully like. "There's something else," he said. She went still. "The investigation. The cooperating witnesses." He looked at his hands. "One of them is someone I've known for 20 years. Ran certain operations for me. I trusted him the way you trust people who have been beside you through enough situations that trust stops being a choice and becomes structural. He's talking to federal prosecutors. He's been talking for 8 months. He said it with the flatness of someone who has processed the betrayal past the emotional part and arrived at the factual part, which takes longer and is worse. His name is Roland Vess. He knows everything. Structure, finances, operations, names." He paused. "He knows about you." The room was very quiet. "What does he know about me?" she said carefully. "That you're here, that the property was transferred, that we have a—" He stopped. "That you're important to me." And he told prosecutors that. "Yes." "Which means I'm in the documentation." "Yes." She sat with that, the specific weight of being named in something she had never agreed to enter, of being made part of a story she hadn't been asked to join. "For how long?" she said. "Since approximately January, when you started coming to the manor regularly. So for the entire time I was building the bakery. For every Saturday in the library, and every Tuesday, and every conversation in the kitchen, I was already in someone's federal file." "Yes." She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark grounds, the stone wall, the bare trees, the deep quiet of a property that had been many things to many people and was still standing. She thought about Christmas Eve. She thought about the cold and the broken car and the window cracked 2 inches and the moment she had opened the door. She turned around. "I'm going to ask you something," she said. "And I need you to answer it the same way you answered me in the coffee shop. Not managed. Not the version that protects you." He said nothing. Waiting. "Did you know Roland Vess was cooperating when you gave me the building?" The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. "No," he said. "I found out 6 weeks after." She looked at him. 6 weeks after," she said. "So you knew by the time the bakery opened?" "Yes." "And you still didn't tell me." "I was trying to resolve it." "You keep saying that." Her voice was not loud. It had gone somewhere past loud, into a register she hadn't known she owned. You keep saying you were trying to resolve it. You have been resolving things your entire life without telling the people affected. That's not protection. That's control. He didn't look away. Yes, he said. It is. The acknowledgement was so clean and so complete that it took the wind out of her response. She sat back down. They looked at each other across the room. I don't know how to be in a relationship that doesn't operate that way, he said. It cost him something to say it. She could see the cost. Not embarrassment. Something more structural. I've run everything on the basis that information is leverage and sharing it is exposure, and the fewer people who know what I know, the safer everything is. That's not I understand. That's not how people are supposed to work with each other. I understand it. I'm not sure I know how to do it differently. You're going to have to learn, she said. He looked at her. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I'm furious with you. I'm going to be furious with you for a while. But I'm not going anywhere? She said this with a steadiness she recognized as new the kind that comes from knowing where the ground is, even when everything on top of it is shifting. What I need from you is information. From now on. Not managed, not resolved before you tell me. Information, when it's relevant to my life, whether it's comfortable or not. And if it implicates me, he said, the information. If telling you creates legal exposure for you, that's my risk to take, she said. Not yours to make for me. He was quiet for a long time. Okay, he said, for the second time that evening. Okay, she said back. Margaret came in at 8 o'clock and put food on the desk without being asked and looked at both of them with the expression of a woman who has seen enough of the specific aftermath of honest conversations to recognize it on sight and knows that food is the correct response. They ate, not with ease, not with the warmth of Saturday mornings in the library, with the careful, deliberate effort of two people eating in the same room after something has been broken and before they have established what rebuilding looks like. It was enough. For tonight, it was enough. Beth Corwin called the next morning with a voice that meant she had found something. I've been in the documents, she said. There's an argument to be made. It's not simple, and it's going to require Ashbourne's legal team to cooperate fully, and it's going to require some things from you. What things? The bakery's financial records. Everything's sales, invoices, supplier contracts, employment records for your 2 staff. We need to establish that the empty chair is a functioning independent business entity, not a front. That it generates real revenue from real operations. She paused. Can you get me all of that? Yes. Today? By tonight. Good. A beat, Claire. This is winnable. I'm not going to tell you it's certain. But it's winnable. She hung up and sat in her kitchen at the bakery before the morning prep started, and she thought, winnable. Not won, not given to her. Not resolved before she knew it was a problem. Winnable by her own hand, with her own records, with the evidence of her own work. She went to the filing cabinet under the prep counter, and she started pulling documents. The federal agents arrived on a Thursday, 2 of them. Suits, credentials, the particular effect of people conducting official business who have done it enough times that it has become procedural. They came to the bakery at 9 in the morning when it was full a deliberate choice. She understood immediately, the kind of choice designed to maximize the weight of the moment. They asked for Claire Whitcomb. She came from the kitchen herself because she was not going to let Dara or Luis handle this. Miss Whitcomb, the taller one said, we'd like to ask you some questions about your relationship with Gideon Ashbourne and the transfer of the property at this address. The shop had gone the specific kind of quiet. That means everyone is listening. She looked at the 2 agents. She thought about Sandra Reeve on the sidewalk. She thought about Beth Corwin's voice, saying, winnable. She thought about a tilted lamp in a small sitting room and a man who read 3 notebooks with real attention. She thought about her mother's voice, saying, there isn't room, and the sound of 14 people and 13 chairs, and the long drive through the snow, and the window cracked 2 inches, and the door she had finally opened. I'd like to call my lawyer, she said. You can wait. The taller agent looked at the shorter one. Of course, he said. She went to the back and called Beth, and stood at her prep table with her hand steady on the phone, and the smell of the morning's baking still in the air, the lemon cake in the oven. the rolls cooling on the rack, and when Beth answered, she said, "They're here. Both of them. What do I do?" Beth's voice was immediate and clear and completely certain. "Tell me exactly what they said and then don't say another word to them until I get there," she told her. Exactly. Every word. Then she went back out to the front of the shop, and she looked at the two federal agents standing beside her counter, and she looked at Dara, who was frozen behind the pastry case, and she looked at Luis, who had positioned himself near the register, with the specific stillness of a man who's staying calm because someone needs to, and she looked at the line of customers who had come for lemon cake and coffee on a Thursday morning and found something considerably more significant. "My lawyer's on her way," Claire said. "Would you like coffee while you wait?" The taller agent blinked. He had not expected that. "Sure," he said after a moment. She poured it herself, because she was not going to stand in her own bakery and let anyone else pour the coffee, and she set the cups on the counter with hands that did not shake. And she stood behind her counter in the place she had built, and she waited for Beth Corwin to arrive. And she did not look away from the door. And when the oven timer went off behind her, she called to Dara without turning around. "Can you get that?" And Dara said yes in a small voice, and Claire heard the oven open and felt the wave of warm air from the kitchen and smelled the cake and thought, not yet. They had not taken it yet. Beth arrived in 22 minutes, which was fast enough that she must have run 2 red lights, still pulling on her coat as she came through the door, her bag over one shoulder, and her eyes doing the rapid assessment of someone who has walked into worse situations than this and always found the geometry of them. She took one look at the agents, one look at Claire. Outside, she said to the agents, pleasantly, completely firm, "Let's not do this in my client's place of business." The shorter agent started to say something. Beth looked at him with the expression of someone who has read the relevant statutes and would be delighted to discuss them. They went outside. Claire stood at her counter. Luis looked at her. "You okay?" "Yes," she said. "You need anything?" "Keep the line moving," she said. People came for coffee. He nodded and turned to the first customer, in line with an efficiency and a normalcy that Claire thought, in that moment, she would remember for the rest of her life. She could hear Beth's voice through the glass, not the words, just the tone, steady and technical and entirely unintimidated. The agents were not going to get what they came for today. And tomorrow, Claire was going to walk into whatever came next with every financial record, every sales log, every supplier, every employment document, every piece of evidence that the empty chair was real and was hers and was worth fighting for, and she was going to make the argument herself, through Beth, through proper channels, through the machinery of the law that she had spent her career calculating insurance claims around and had never once thought to use in her own defense. She was going to fight, not because someone told her to, not because someone else had resolved things on her behalf, because she had built something from nothing. She was not going to stand in her own kitchen and watch it be carried out the door without making every possible argument that it belonged to her. Through the window, she could see Beth making a point, her hand cutting the air in a specific gesture that meant she was citing something specific, and the agents knew it. The taller agent said something. Beth said something back. The shorter agent pulled out his phone. Claire watched. And somewhere beside her, the oven timer went off again, and Dara called her name, and she turned toward the kitchen, and she went back to work. Because the cake wasn't going to pull itself from the oven, and the morning wasn't finished, and whatever was about to happen, whatever the next hours and days and weeks were going to require of her, it was going to require her to be standing and functional and present. She pulled the cake from the oven, set it on the rack, and the smell of lemon and butter and the cardamom glaze filled the kitchen in a wave that was warm and real and entirely hers. And she put on her oven mitts, and she thought about what Beth had said, winnable, and she thought about what Gideon had said in the coffee shop, I was wrong, and she thought about what her mother had said on Christmas Eve in front of 14 people and 13 chairs, and she understood that every one of those moments had been building to this one, to this kitchen, to this rack, to this cake, to the fact that she was here and still standing and not done. Not even close to done. Outside, Beth turned back towards her face through the glass, said something Claire was going to have to read very carefully, when she got there, and the agents were still standing the sidewalk, and the line inside the bakery was still moving, and Luis was handing someone a cup with the steady efficiency of a man holding down the fort. Sound like greens and the morning light through the large windows of the corner, building on Hawthorne Avenue and lying across the floor in long rectangles that reached almost to the kitchen door. Beth came back in. She looked at Claire across the counter and said the 4 words that meant everything was still in motion, that nothing was over, that the fight was not won and was not lost, and was exactly where fights like this live in the space between, where the only thing that matters is who decides to keep standing when the options run out. They're coming back Friday. Friday came the way bad things do ordinary on the surface. The same gray November light through the bakery windows, the same smells, the same sounds of the street outside Hawthorne Avenue, waking up and underneath it, everything taut and waiting. Claire had not slept more than 3 hours. She knew this because she had watched the ceiling of her apartment go from dark to gray to the particular pale light of early morning. And at 5, she had gotten up and gone to the bakery, because the bakery was the only place her hands knew what to do with themselves. She made the dough by feel, by the weight of it under her palms, by the sound of it against the bowl. She made 3 batches of rolls and 2 of the brown butter almond cake, and she pulled the lemon cakes from the oven at 6:40, and stood in the hot breath of the open oven and held the rack with both hands and breathed. Beth had told her what to expect. The agents would return with documentation, possibly a formal seizure notice, possibly additional questions, depending on what their supervisors had decided overnight. Beth had spent the previous 48 hours in Ashbourne's legal team's files, building the argument that the empty chair was a legitimate independent business entity whose assets were inseparable from Claire's own labor, investment, and creative identity in ways that federal forfeiture law was obligated to consider. The argument was sound, Beth said. It was not guaranteed. Sound but not guaranteed. Claire had written that on a piece of paper and folded it and put it in her apron pocket and had not looked at it again because she knew what it said. Gideon called at 6:15. She answered on the first ring because she had been holding the phone. "How are you?" he said. "Ask me after 10 o'clock. I'll be there. You don't have to be, Claire." His voice through the phone was steady and low, the voice she had come to know as the one he used when he was being entirely direct. "I'm going to be there." She didn't argue. She didn't say thank you. She said okay, and hung up and went back to the rolls. Luis arrived at 6:30 and looked at the volume of baked goods, already cooling on every available surface, and said, without inflection, "You've been here a while." "Since 5. He put on his apron. He didn't say anything else, which was why Claire valued Luis above almost every person she had ever employed, which was a short list but a meaningful one. Dara came in at 7 and looked at the production volume, and then at Claire's face and said, "I brought you breakfast," and put a paper bag on the counter that contained a breakfast sandwich from the diner, 2 blocks over, which Claire did not want and ate anyway because her body was going to need something to run on today, and she had spent too many years ignoring that particular requirement. The shop opened at 7. Customers came. The regular Thursday crowd, the people who had built a habit around this corner on Hawthorne, the woman who always ordered the brown butter cake and ate it standing at the counter because she claimed sitting down made her feel like she was being too indulgent. Claire worked the counter and the kitchen both, moving between them with the efficiencies of someone who has learned her own space. And at 8:15, a man she didn't recognize came in and ordered a black coffee and sat at the corner table with his phone face down and didn't touch the coffee. And she understood he was one of Gideon's people, and he was here before Gideon. At 9:15, Gideon came in. He was wearing a coat she hadn't seen before, darker, heavier, the coat of someone who had dressed for the specific gravity of this particular morning. A sound like green wood splitting. He came to the counter and looked at her and did not say anything, and she looked at him, and there was something between them that didn't need language. The thing that builds between people who have been genuinely honest with each other in a hard room and are still standing on the same side. He sat at the table near the window, not at the counter, giving her room. Beth arrived at 9:40 with her bag and her coat, and the specific forward-leaning energy of a lawyer who has been awake as long as Claire has and has spent that time more productively. She came straight to the counter. "They'll be here at 10, she said. "I've spoken to their supervising prosecutor this morning. There's a negotiation window I told you there might be." She set her bag on the counter and pulled out a folder. "Look at this." Claire looked. It was a legal, dense, specific 4 pages that Beth had assembled in 48 hours from the bakery's financial records and Ashford's property documentation, and 3 relevant federal cases that Beth had apparently found at 2 in the morning and annotated by hand in the margins. The argument is that the asset the building is encumbered by a legitimate commercial enterprise that predates the forfeiture action, Beth said. Your business, your equipment, your recipes, your staff contracts, your revenue. The argument is that seizing the building without accounting for the legitimate business interest is an overcorrection, and that the government's interest can be satisfied by a financial settlement that doesn't require physical seizure of the address. She looked at Claire. In plain English, they might take a payment instead of the building. How much of a payment? Beth named a number. Claire absorbed it. She did the math. That's everything I have. Plus more. There's a loan option. Against the business assets, the equipment, the goodwill, the established revenue. A commercial lender would look at the past 6 weeks' numbers and the review and consider it. Beth paused. It's not the worst position, Claire. It's not easy. But it's a path, versus losing the building entirely. Versus losing the building and fighting a seizure in federal court for 2 years while the bakery operates on borrowed time. Beth was direct in the way Claire had needed since the beginning. This is the better path. Okay. Claire folded the brief, closed. What do I do? When they arrive, you say nothing that I don't tell you to say. You let me do the talking. You look like what you are, which is a woman who built a legitimate business. Beth looked at her appraisingly. Which you did. I know, good. Beth picked up her bag. I'm going to get coffee. At 10:03, the 2 federal agents came through the door. The same 2, the taller one whose name was Garrett, and the shorter one whose name Claire had never gotten. They came in with the same procedural affect, but something was different this morning. Something in the way they scanned the room, registered Beth at the counter, and Gideon at the window table, and the man at the corner whose coffee was still untouched, and made the calculation that this was not going to be the straightforward seizure proceeding they had, perhaps expected on Thursday. Garrett looked at Beth. Counselor, he said. Agent Garrett. Beth was already moving toward the door. I've reserved the space next door. There's an empty unit. The owner let me in this morning. We'll conduct this there, not in my client's operating business. Garrett looked at Claire. Claire looked back at him. Ms. Whitcomb, he said. Good morning, she said. They moved next door. The empty unit was cold and bare concrete floors, bare walls, the particular emptiness of a commercial space between tenants. Beth had brought 2 folding chairs from somewhere, and a table and a power strip that suggested she had been in this building before 10 o'clock. It had the feeling of a room assembled in a hurry that was going to determine something that mattered. Claire sat across from Garrett. Beth sat beside her. The shorter agent, whose name turned out to be Morales, had a laptop and a folder, and the demeanor of someone who was here to observe and document rather than lead. Garrett opened his folder. Ms. Whitcomb, he said. We're here regarding the property at. He cited the Hawthorne Avenue address, which was transferred to you by Gideon Ashbourne in February of this year, as part of what we believe was an attempt to shield assets from federal seizure in an ongoing investigation. My client received the property as consideration for a legitimate business arrangement, Beth said. The documentation of that arrangement is in the brief I sent to your supervising prosecutor at 7:15 this morning. Beth's voice was pleasant and absolutely immovable. Page 12. Garrett looked at Morales. Something passed between them. For the next 90 minutes, Beth argued. Claire sat beside her and watched Garrett's face for the things that moved across it and tried to read the room the way she had learned to read rooms, not with the old fear, not with the instinct to make herself smaller, but with the clear-eyed attention of someone who has decided to be present. The argument was technical. It was about property law and forfeiture statutes and the established revenue of a 6-week-old bakery. and the precedent set in 3 federal cases from 2 different circuits. Claire followed approximately 60% of it and trusted Beth with the rest. At 11:40, Garrett said something to Morales in a low voice. Morales typed something. Garrett looked at Claire. Not at Beth, at Claire. Ms. Whitcomb, he said. You understand that the investigation into Gideon Ashbourne's operations is ongoing. That your name appears in that investigation. That any ongoing association with him may create continued legal complexity for you and your business. I understand that, Claire said. Beth put a hand briefly on her arm, a signal that said, careful. I'm not asking her to make statements about her personal life, Claire said to Beth, not to Garrett. He's informing me of a legal reality. I'm acknowledging that I understand it. She looked back at Garrett. I do, understand it. Garrett held her gaze. The arrangement your lawyer has proposed, he said. We'll take it back to our supervisor. There will be conditions. What conditions? Beth said. Full financial disclosure from the business for the next 24 months. Any transfer of assets above a certain threshold requires prior notification. And a deliberate pause. Miss Whitcomb's continued operation of the business must be demonstrably independent of Ashbourne's financial involvement. Claire felt that land. Meaning, she said, meaning the business must operate without his funding, his property, or his direct involvement. If we find evidence of continued financial entanglement, the settlement is void, and the seizure proceeds. The room was very quiet. She has the building, Beth said. The settlement would resolve the building. The settlement resolves our claim on the building, Garrett said. But going forward, the business's continued operation in that building is contingent on the conditions I just named. Beth started to say something else, and Claire put her own hand on Beth's arm this time, lightly. I understand the conditions, Claire said. All of them. She looked at Garrett, and she did not look away. When will you have an answer from your supervisor? Beth said. End of business today. They stood. They shook hands. They left. The empty unit was cold in the silence after the door closed. Beth exhaled, long and controlled. That went better than it could have. Yes, the conditions are real, Claire. The independence requirement means... I know what it means. Claire stood up. Her knees were not entirely steady. She put a hand on the folding table. No more money from Gideon. No operational involvement. The building is the last thing I can take from him, and then I'm on my own. Financially, yes. All right, she said. She walked back into the bakery. Gideon was still at the window table, and he looked at her when she came in, and she looked at him, and she understood that he had already calculated what the conditions were going to be. He was, above everything else, a man who understood leverage and terms, and the cost of being adjacent to his name. She came to his table and sat across from him. You heard, she said. Some of it the conditions. Yes, she looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light was coming through the large windows, and lying across the table between them and the bakery was warm and smelled like everything she had made that morning, and the line at the counter was still moving because Luis was managing it with his customary invaluable steadiness. This is what it is, she said. I know. The building is the last thing. I know, and then I run it myself. No more, Claire. His voice was quiet and entire. I know. I knew before we walked in there. He looked at his hands on the table and then back at her. This was always going to be yours. From the first day. The only question was the path. The path has been considerably more complicated than you led me to believe. Yes, he said, it has. She looked at him for a long time. At the face she had come to know over 11 months that had rearranged her life from the outside in and the inside out, and that she was not done knowing, would not be done knowing, regardless of what federal agents said about financial independence. I love you, she said. That's not contingent on the conditions. That's not going to change, because a federal agent told me it creates legal complexity. He looked at her with something that was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. The armor was down all the way. Under it was a man of 53 who had spent 11 years in a beautiful tomb, and then found a woman on the side of a road on Christmas Eve who had cracked 2 inches of window and changed everything. I know, he said. But the money is done, she said. We're clear on that. We're clear. And you're going to tell me things. she said. From now on, when they're relevant, before they become my problem. Yes. Even when you think you can resolve it first. Even then. Okay, he said. Beth appeared at the table with her bag and her coat and her phone, which was buzzing. I have to take this, she said, and moved toward the door, and Claire watched her go and then looked back at Gideon. The gala, she said. He had been waiting for this. The new Business of the Year Award Gala was in 3 weeks. The bakery had been nominated in October, which had arrived as a phone call Claire had made Dara listen to because she genuinely did not trust her own hearing. The award was Briar Glen County's designation for businesses under 2 years old that had demonstrated exceptional impact on the commercial community, which was a formal way of saying that something real had happened here and people had noticed. My family will be there, she said. They'll know about the award. Mallory will have made sure she knows the guest list. I imagine. I'm not going to manage that moment. I'm not going to decide in advance what I say or how I handle it. She looked at him. But I need you to know it's coming, so that when it happens, you're not surprised. I won't be surprised, he said. I'll be there, standing behind me, wherever you need. The call from the supervising prosecutor's office came at 4:57 that afternoon, 3 minutes before the end of business. Beth took it in the back kitchen while Claire stood at the prep table and pretended to be doing something with the following morning's supply list. She listened to one side of a phone call and read Beth's face through the parts she could see, and when Beth hung up, she turned around, and her expression was. They accepted, Beth said. The supply list in Claire's hands crinkled slightly. The conditions stand, Beth continued. The financial settlement amount is as discussed. You'll have 60 days to arrange the financing and make the payment. After that, the seizure notice is withdrawn, and the building is clear. 60 days. I've already put in a call to 2 commercial lenders who know the business climate here. Your revenue numbers from the past 6 weeks, and the review, Claire, you're a fundable business. This is real. You can borrow against what you've built. She set the supply list down. Okay, she said. You're going to need to sign some things. Tomorrow is fine. Tonight, Beth looked at her with the expression of someone who has been in high-pressure rooms all day and is releasing the pressure deliberately. Tonight you should eat something and sleep. People keep telling me that. Because you keep not doing it. Beth put on her coat. I'll be here at 9 tomorrow. She left. Dara left at 5. Luis locked the front and put the chairs on the tables and left at 5:15 after checking twice that Claire didn't need anything and being told twice that she didn't. Claire stood alone in the bakery. She stood in the middle of the front room, in the space between the counter and the tables, in the warm smell of the day's baking and the quiet of a shop that had just closed. And she looked at the sign above the door visible, from the inside in reverse, the letters backward from where she stood. But she had looked at it enough times that she could read it, without thinking. The empty chair. She had built this. She had built it from 3 notebooks on a closet shelf and a broken alternator and a cracked car window and the specific fury of a woman who had cooked an entire Christmas dinner and been told to eat it in the kitchen. She had built it from 22 years of waiting for permission that was never going to come. And from the moment she understood that the permission was never going to come, and from everything that came after. It was hers. It was going to stay hers. She turned off the kitchen lights and the prep room lights, and she put on her coat, and she locked the front door, and she stood on the sidewalk of Hawthorne Avenue in the November cold and looked up at the sign. Then she went home. The gala was held on the first Friday of December in Briar Glens County Hall, which was a building that had been everything from a courthouse to a community center over its 140 years, and now hosted, among other events, an annual ceremony where the county's business community recognized itself and drank wine and circulated in the way of people who were primarily interested in who else was in the room. Claire wore blue, not the deliberate, calculated blue of someone who had read about color theory and power dressing. The blue of a dress she had found in a shop on Meridian Street on a Tuesday afternoon when she had 40 minutes between prep work and supplier calls, a winter blue that, the woman at the shop said, brought out something in her eyes. And Claire had looked in the mirror and thought, yes, and bought it, which was itself a small revolution. She had bought a dress because she liked it, not because it was appropriate, or safe or unlikely to draw attention. Because she liked it. Gideon picked her up at 7:15 in the black sedan, and when she got in, he looked at the dress and then at her face and said, "You look like yourself," which was not a conventional compliment and was the best one she had ever received. The gala was loud and warm and crowded, in the way of events that are larger than the venue, but nobody says so. Claire knew some faces. The food columnist who had written the review was there, a small woman with a direct gaze who smiled at Claire with the genuine warmth of someone who had meant what she wrote. Business owners whose faces she recognized from the commercial strip. County officials whose names she had learned from the nomination paperwork. She was working the room in the way she had learned to work rooms this year, not performing, not managing, just being present and direct and willing to engage when she saw her family. They were across the room, all three of them, her parents and Mallory, and they had clearly seen her first because their formation had shifted in the specific way of global regrouping for an approach. Howard looked older than he had in the hospital. Judith was wearing the same pearls she always wore to events. Mallory was in red and had already identified the most influential people in the room and positioned herself accordingly, which was a skill Claire had to admit her sister possessed. She watched them approach. She did not move toward them or away from them. Judith reached her first. "You look beautiful," her mother said. She said it with something Claire had to recalibrate to something that was not the managed warmth of performance, but might have been real. She couldn't be entirely certain, and she wasn't going to pretend certainty, but she noted it. "Thank you," Claire said. Howard shook her hand, which was unusual enough that she registered it. "Congratulations," he said. "On the nomination, Margaret the bakery," he stopped. "Something, Claire." "Yes," she said. "It is," Mallory hugged her. It was the hug of someone who had practiced it, not fake exactly, but aware of itself. Claire returned it with the measured warmth of someone who remembered the restaurant and the text message that were inappropriate, and was not going to pretend none of that had happened, but was also not going to turn a gala into a reckoning. They stood together for a moment, the four of them. "I heard it was a difficult few months," Judith said. With the "I heard" there were legal issues. With the building. "There were," Claire said. "I handled them. With the Gideon's help." "No," Claire said. Pleasantly, completely clearly. "With my lawyer's help. And my own financial records. And the business I built." She looked at her mother without heat. "I handled it." Judith's mouth moved slightly. Howard said, "Good for you." And he said it in a way that was not the period at the end of a sentence voice. It was something else. She filed it. Mallory said, "I told everyone you were always going to do something amazing. You just needed the right push." Claire looked at her sister. There was a version of this moment where she said nothing, where she let the revision stand. The convenient family mythology in which they had always believed in her, had always been behind her, had always known. It would be easier. It would cost her nothing tonight. She had enough to carry tonight without adding this. But she had stopped doing easier when it cost her the truth. "You didn't know about the bakery idea," Claire said, to Mallory, to all of them, keeping her voice entirely even. "Nobody in this family did. I had 3 notebooks on a closet shelf for 22 years. Nobody ever asked what I wanted to do. Not once." She looked at them. "I'm not saying that to be unkind. I'm saying it because I want to be accurate. I built something. I built it without this family knowing I had wanted to. And I'm proud of that." She paused. "If you want to be proud of it too, that's genuinely okay. But we need to be clear about whose work it is." Mallory had gone slightly pale under her composure. Howard looked at the floor and then back at his oldest daughter with the expression of a man who is doing arithmetic he should have done 20 years ago. Judith said quietly, "We owe you better than we gave you." Claire looked at her mother. Judith Whitcomb did not say things like that. She said things adjacent to things like that. She made gestures toward acknowledgement, without completing them. She worked around the perimeter of apology without reaching the center. This was the most direct statement Claire had heard from her in 41 years. "Yes," Claire said, "you do." A pause that held everything. "I don't know yet what that looks like," Claire continued. "I'm not ready to pretend it's resolved. But I'm not here to punish you. I don't want that." She looked at all 3 of them. "I want my family to be capable of knowing who I actually am. That's what I want. I don't know if that's possible. But I'm willing to find out slowly if you are. Howard nodded. Once. The same way Margaret nodded at coffee, a verdict. Mallory said, I'm sorry, Claire. And it came out cracked. Not managed, and Claire thought it might have real. And she held that thought carefully, because real and permanent were not the same thing, and she was done collapsing the distance between them. I know, she said. Then Gideon was beside her. She hadn't seen him approach, but she felt him, the specific gravity of his presence, and she didn't need to look to know he was there. She looked anyway. He was looking at her family with the steady, unreadable assessment of a man who has classified everyone in the room within 60 seconds and is choosing his behavior accordingly. He said nothing to them. He looked at Claire. They're calling the award, he said. She looked toward the stage, where the county chamber president was approaching a podium. She looked back at her family. We'll talk, she said. Not tonight, but we will. She took Gideon's hand, and she walked across the room toward the front, through the crowd, through the warm noise of 200 people celebrating the county's commercial year. And when the chamber president said her name and said the empty chair, she walked to the stage, and she did not look back. The podium was higher than it looked from the floor. She stood at it with the award, a small, heavy thing, bronze, the kind of object that is significant because of what it represents rather than what it is. And she looked out at the room, and she said what she said. She did not have notes. She had thought about what she was going to say if they called her name, and she had not written it down because writing it down would have made it a performance, and she did not want this to be a performance. She said that the bakery was called the Empty Chair because she had spent most of her life believing she deserved only what was left over after everyone else was comfortable. She said that for a long time she thought that was just how things were, that some people had chairs and some people had kitchens. And she was the kitchen kind. She said that she had been wrong, and that being wrong about it had cost her 22 years, and that she was not interested in being sentimental about the cost, because sentiment didn't get the rolls in the oven. People laughed. She had not expected that. She absorbed it and continued. She said that she had built the Empty Chair from notebooks she kept in a closet because she believed that when the recipes were in the notebooks, they were hers, and nobody could tell her they were wrong or small or unnecessary. She said sound like green wood splitting. She said that the first person she showed them to had looked at every page and said they were extraordinary, and that she was still not sure she believed it completely, but she was working on it. She said that if there was anyone in the room tonight who had something on a shelf, literally or otherwise something they had stopped believing, had a right to exist in the world, she wanted them to think about why they stopped believing that and whether the people who convinced them were actually right. She looked out at the room. She said, "The chair isn't empty anymore, and neither are you." There was a beat of silence. Then applause, the kind that is not polite but genuine, and she stood at the podium and felt it, and did not look for Gideon right away, because she wanted to stand in it alone. For one moment, the specific aloneness of having made something that belonged entirely to herself, the thing nobody can take because they didn't give it. Then she looked. He was at the back of the room, and the distance between them was large, and across it she could see his face, which was not performing anything. He was watching her, the way he had watched her from the beginning, with the complete attention she had once found unnerving and had come to understand as the most honest thing about him. He said something she couldn't hear. She read it anyway. "I see you." She almost smiled, standing at the podium, because she didn't need it the way she once would have. She was not standing at the podium because someone finally saw her. She was standing at the podium because she had finally stopped, and those were not the same thing at all, and understanding the difference was the whole of the last 11 months. She stepped down from the stage. The food columnist found her first a brief, warm exchange, a promise to come by the bakery next week. Then several business owners, whose names she now knew. Then a young woman of about 25, who said, quietly, in the way of someone saying something if not said out loud before, "I have notebooks too." And Claire looked at her and said, "Show someone." And the young woman nodded with the specific seriousness of someone receiving information they needed. Gideon reached her eventually through the crowd. He didn't say anything. He handed her a glass of water because she had been talking for a long time, and he noticed things like that. She drank the water. Your family, he said. I know. I saw. How was it? She thought about Judith's sentence. The most direct one. It was a beginning, she said. A small one, with a lot of distance still to cover. But a beginning. Yes. He nodded. They stood together in the warm room, and the ceremony moved on to other awards and other speeches, and the crowd circulated, and the wine poured. And Claire stood with Gideon's hand in hers, and felt the weight of the bronze award in her other hand, and felt the evening in her bones, the exhaustion of it, the relief of it, the specific gravity of a day that has meant something. They left at 10. The drive to her apartment was quiet in the way of people who do not need to fill silence. The streets of Briar Glen were cold and dark, and lit with the beginning of December's commercial decorations lights, strung across the commercial district, a wreath on the hardware store door, the diner with its window, lit yellow and warm. She had driven these streets her whole life. They looked different now. Not better in the scenic sense, not more beautiful. Splitting. Different in the way that the world looks different when you have changed your position inside it, when you have moved from the background of your own life to the foreground. And the view shifts not because the world has changed, but because you have stopped standing behind things. Gideon walked her to her door. He did this without discussion, had done it since she started letting him, which was itself a decision she hadn't announced, but had made the decision to let someone walk her to her door because she was worth the walk. At the door she turned. Come to the bakery Sunday, she said. Margaret, too. I'm doing the new winter menu testing. I need people with opinions. Margaret has opinions about everything. That's why I want her. He looked at her, in the way he had looked at her across the room, the complete, unguarded way. I'll be there, he said. She went inside. She took off the blue dress and hung it in the closet where she could see it, and she made tea, and she sat on her couch in the quiet apartment and held the bronze award in her lap and looked at it. Then she put it on the shelf above her kitchen table, where she could see it from her chair. She was going to need to refinance and restructure and spend the next 2 years under the condition of financial transparency that the federal agreement required, and build the bakery into something that could absorb all of that and keep growing. She was going to need to have real conversations with her family over real time and not collapse the distance or pretend it was covered before it was. She was going to love a man who was still in the process of dismantling the structures of a life built on entirely different principles from her own. A slow and genuine process that she watched without directing and without waiting for it to be finished before she let it matter. She was going to do all of this imperfectly, in the way that people do things when they are actually doing them rather than planning them. She drank her tea. The apartment was quiet and warm and entirely hers, and the award was on the shelf. A sound like green wood splitting were still, and the notebooks that had kitchen table, where she had left them open to the lemon cake recipe, the one she had made for Gideon in his kitchen, on a January night, the one that had gone into the first oven, the one that had become the signature without being planned that way. She looked at her own handwriting on that page, 22 years old, sitting at a different kitchen table in a different life, writing a recipe for a cake she believed in, even when she believed in almost nothing else about her own worth. Writing it down because the notebooks were hers, and nobody could take them. She had been right about that. She had been right about the cake. She closed the notebook. The winter was coming the way winters do in Connecticut, early and full and cold in the way that means business. And in the morning she was going to open the bakery and make the lemon cake and pull the rolls from the oven and pour the first coffee. Turn the sign from close loose to open, and the line would be outside the door before she finished the turn. And she was going to spend the day doing the work she had always known how to do in the place she had built to do it. She got up and washed the mug. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed, and this time she slept fully, without watching the ceiling, without the arithmetic of fear running in the background, without waiting for the thing that was coming to finally arrive. Because the thing that was coming had come, and she had stood in front of it with her in order, and her lawyer beside her, and her hands steady, and she was still here. The chair was hers. It had always been hers. She had simply spent 41 years waiting for someone to tell her she could sit down. She stopped waiting. She built the room herself.